Thank you. I'll go ahead and get started by introducing our second panel for this afternoon. Our second panel will be covering Islamophobia and protecting our communities during a time of polarization. Championing inclusivity and safeguarding our communities against othering is imperative. We must address the harmful impacts of othering within our society to combat discrimination and foster a sense of belonging. By actively promoting inclusivity and understanding, we can protect our community from the divisive effects of media, labeling, and marginalization. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Panel 2's moderator, Petra Al-Soufi, who is a Senior Outreach and Partnership Manager at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Thank you, Petra.
Thank you, Iman. Thank you, Iman. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for joining us this morning. And before I get started, I want to thank all the organizers of this conference and all the team behind the scene that have helped put this over a long period of time. We've been working on this for months and obviously had to make so many adjustments to reflect the moment that we're in here today. So round of applause for all of them. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to set the stage a little bit for the conversation today. Then I'll introduce our amazing panelists who, you know, I would like to say need no introduction, but I will introduce them. And we will jump right into the conversation, and then you'll have a chance to ask your questions. Please write them down on note cards. We are here talking about the most ethnically faith diversity in the nation. American Muslims make up around 1% of the total population of this country. Yet if you're watching the news, or if you watch movies, or if you watch anything on social media, it makes it seem like we're about 20 million people. We're not. Studies show that the New York Times and other media outlets have portrayed American Muslims and Islam worse than cancer and cocaine for more than 20 years. And a lot of the negative things that happen in our society, the first things that people jump into, associating them with American Muslims. It undermines all the impact and all the contributions that we have made into this country as a very ethnically diverse faith community here. As the panel before me talked about and hinted at, we have African Americans, who's around 28% of the total population, or 20% of American Muslims. We have Native Americans, 1% of the Muslim population. We have Arab Americans, Latinos, and Hispanics, white American Muslims, and all ethnicities are represented in our community. And so in theory, all of the social justice and the issues that this country is dealing with today are part of our story and part of our narrative. And when we talk about Islamophobia, it's something that people want to debate, whether it's a real thing or not. We at ISPU have been documenting this for many years, as well as many other on this panel and other organizations. In our research, we show, unfortunately, that Islamophobia is, the good thing, it's not the majority of people, but it is on the rise. It is continuing to increase. It does not have a connection to people's religious beliefs or religiosity, but it has everything to do with political cycles and elections. And we are in the midst of one of the most heated election cycles, as well as all of the international conflicts that are taking place. Our research also showed that Muslims are negatively impacted. It's pervasive. It's institutional, where a third of American Muslims face discrimination and Islamophobia in institutional settings. Everything from healthcare to law enforcement, engagement with law enforcement, in education setting, while traveling, we all know that, and in so many other places. And our students are not exempt from facing religious-based bullying, where K-12 students, their families, around 50% of families report having a child in the public school setting who have faced religious-based bullying in the school in the last year. And so it begs the question of, why would children be discriminated against just because of their religious identity if it's not something to do with what we have internalized about the American Muslim community? And so I could go on and on and on, and that's why we have this panel here, to help us understand, where did all of this come from? Is it new? Is it something that we've been dealing with for many times? Is it because we are a religious or we're a racialized community? And we will conclude by talking about how American Muslims are responding to this. The authorization and disenfranchisement of American Muslims happen in so many settings, including while voting, while trying to be civically engaged, while trying to open places of worship, and so on and so forth. So to help us understand this dilemma and the situation that we have, I have esteemed panelists here who I will try to do my best to introduce them. But of course, we could spend a lot more time trying to introduce their extensive work. I'm going to start by Sahar Aziz, Distinguished Professor of Law and Chancellor of Social Justice Scholar and Middle Eastern Legal Studies Scholar at Rutgers University Law School. Sorry, English is not my first language. Sahar Aziz scholarship examines the intersection of national security, race, religion, and civil rights with a focus on adverse impact of national security laws and policies on racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. She's the author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Questions Religious Freedom, and the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Professor Aziz is a recipient of the Derek A. Bell Award from the Association of American Law School and was named a Middle Eastern and North African American National Security and Foreign Policy Next Generation Leader by New America in 2020 and a Soros Equality Fellow in 2021. Thank you, Dr. Orton. Thank you, Sahab. Next to her, I have Robert McCaw, who is the Director of the Government Affairs at Department at the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, the nation's largest Muslim civil rights advocacy organization. Since 2011, he has overseen CARE's Muslim civic engagement and empowerment program that bring American Muslim community concerns to Congress, the White House, federal and state agencies. Mr. McCaw also coordinates CARE national and state election activities, including Get Out the Vote campaign and election surveys. Since 2015, he has served as the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations Steering Committee Chairman for the National Muslim Advocacy Day on Capitol Hill. He's also responsible for encouraging Muslim participation in network and coalitions that promote justice and mutual understanding. And next to him, I have Ahmed. Yes, absolutely. Next to him, I have Ahmed Mati, who's the chair of the board of directors at the Muslim American in Public Service, MAPS. He currently serves as a senior economist with the U.S. Department of Justice, developing federal regulations for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearm, and Explosive. He works in similar regulatory capacity at the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Including as acting chief economist with FEMA. He also deployed as an intergovernmental affairs specialist during FEMA emergency response to disaster declarations in Texas and Puerto Rico. And previously, Ahmed served as a Franklin Fellow with the U.S. Department of State's Office of U.S. Foreign Assistance Resources. He held many roles and worked with the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, the Islamic Development Bank, and others. And he is a native New Yorker, where in 2001, post 9/11, he was very active and on the board of Muslim Student Association, the MSAs, and the Arabic Student Association. And he, as I mentioned, he serves on the board right now of MAPS. And last but not least, absolutely. Last but not least, we have Caden Omid? Weemit, wow, very close. He's a sophomore. He's a rising sophomore studying political science at American University here in DC. For over 3 years, he have worked to improve democracy, first in his hometown of Scottsdale, Arizona, and now at the national scale with nonprofits like the Task Force Organization and Public Citizens. At American University, he serves as a government senator where he sponsored the university historic boycott, divest, and sanctions resolution. Currently, he chairs the Student Government Divest from Occupation Commission, which apart from divestment, also works to protect the student rights and to combat Islamophobia on campus. So please help me welcome all of our panelists. And let's start with Sahar. I introduced the broad spectrum of where Islamophobia shows up in American Muslim lives. We are a religious minority community, but we're also a very ethnic and racially diverse community. So help us understand, you write a lot on the racialization of Muslims. Can you help us understand how we look at a religious group in terms of race and how it has built into our policies? And if you're able to elaborate, obviously, on the moment right now, how anti-Palestinian racism is incorporated into that racialization.
Okay. First, I want to thank you for hosting me and thank all of the students for being here and the graduates and those who are gaining some very valuable experience in Washington, D.C. You are the future. You are the leaders that we were not too long ago. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I remember when I was in your seat. So one day you're going to be in this seat, inshallah. So I have three main points that I want to make, and I'm going to be quite transparent. Many of them are based in my book, The Racial Muslim When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. So if your interest is triggered, I'm going to be a good professor and give you homework. So the first point I want to make is that racialization is an adverse process wherein an individual or community's identity is socially constructed, right, to constitute, quote unquote, a race, whatever that is. It's if you go to any other country that doesn't know what a race is, you say, what race are you? They will ask you, I don't even know what that question means. Right? So it's a very Western social construction. But it consistently imputes negative and inferior characteristics upon those who are racialized. So historically, race was created to distinguish between, in the United States, who could be legally enslaved, who could legally own property, who could naturalize to become a US citizen, who could immigrate to the United States, who could vote, and who could live in nice neighborhoods, and who could eat at certain restaurants, and so on. So it had a very specific political, economic, and social objective. Today, race continues to impact the quality and inequality of people's lives and their relationship with the state and the law, and the opportunities available to them that are independent of their individual actions or behavior. Now, that impact, fortunately, is no longer facially explicit in law. Right? Jim Crow era is over. However, it does continue to infect societal and political hierarchies. So the most obvious way, which hopefully many of you know as the kind of BLM generation, is the way that African American communities have been racialized. So, for example, it is no coincidence, and it is absolutely not unintentional, that blacks are disproportionately overrepresented compared to their 13% of the population. They are overrepresented in prisons, in low-income jobs, in poor neighborhoods, in under-resourced schools, and other less advantaged contexts, while simultaneously underrepresented in higher status jobs, in universities and faculties and elected office, and so on. So while every minority is racialized, the way severity and consequences of racialization differ based on that minority's position in American history, domestic politics, foreign policy, and economic system. So negative stereotypes also work to perform the work of racialization by associating a particular minority group or a racialized group as presuming or presumptively to have inherently negative traits, such as being violent, deceitful, disloyal, meek, lazy, dumb, and other negative characteristics. If you look at the Japanese and Chinese, for example, historically, they were stereotyped or racialized as deceitful and dishonest, as loyal only to their country of origin, and culturally unassimilable. So for Muslims, racialization merges physical appearances, and there's what you look like, with religious identity, to associate the religion of Islam with political violence, misogyny, despotism, cultural backwardness, illiberalism, and religious zealotry. Okay, so those are the underlying negative characteristics that are then imputed upon 1.8 billion human beings. So instead of understanding Islam, and by extension, the world's 1.8 billion Muslims, as a complex global religion that has existed over 1,500 years across continents, civilizations, cultures, and governance structures, Islam is maliciously flattened and oversimplified into Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, Hamas, or whatever the latest non-state militia or insurgency group that has arisen in a Muslim-majority country that threatens Western hegemony in those locations. So rather than understand the origins and objectives that those groups have through sophisticated geopolitical, historical, and economic analysis, in other words, why does Hamas exist? Why does Hezbollah exist? Why does Al-Qaeda exist? Why does ISIS exist? Why does the Ku Klux Klan exist? Why do all of these right-wing political racists in Europe exist? Why do, if you are an intellectual, you are seeking to understand, which doesn't mean you're legitimizing or justifying, but that's what we do as intelligent critical thinkers. So instead, the US government and Western elites intentionally misinform the public by aggrandizing these militias to seek to spread the very same fallacy that they want to spread, which is that they represent the Muslim Ummah, and therefore only a war against Muslims within and outside the country, according to the United States, can protect the US from terrorism. Now, facilitating this unsophisticated and anti-intellectual stereotyping of Muslims is the deeply rooted xenophobia in American society that you can't disconnect from the racialization of Muslims. So immigrants have always been treated as a threat to the American way of life. Right? Immigrants, in crass lay terms, are frenemies of America, which is really, so this American way of life is really code for Northwest European Protestant cultural normativity, which continues until today. When you think of, are you an assimilated American? Assimilated into what? To understand bias against Muslims today, we must understand the systemic biases against the Chinese and Japanese immigrants, Mexicans before and after the United States conquered northern Mexico, Central American immigrants today, the first waves of Southern and Eastern European Catholic and Jewish Americans 100 years ago. Because if you don't understand that, then it's very hard to understand today. This is America. So if you have xenophobia, the fear and disdain toward foreigners or those perceived as such, plus racism, right, the social construction of race, then the social construction of genetic-like inferior traits based on skin color, hair texture, facial features, and body structure combine and merge to create what we're seeing today. So what I argue in my book, The Racial Muslim, is that Muslim identity functions as racial identity, to impute upon all of you as Muslims these permanent genetic-like negative stereotypes. For instance, Muslims are treated as inherently sympathetic to terrorism unless they can individually prove otherwise. Muslims are treated as inherently oppressive of women unless you can individually prove otherwise. You are presumed to be intolerant to difference, hateful toward other religious groups, inherently against democracy and individual rights. So once you understand this, then the seemingly ridiculous accusation that Muslims criticizing Israel's war crimes or defending the human rights of Palestinians are supporting Hamas suddenly makes sense, right? If Americans are already primed to racialize Muslims and Arabs, who are erroneously all presumed to be Muslim, as terrorists or terrorist supporters, then it's easy for Islamophobes to just insert the name of the latest terrorist group every time they want to criticize Muslims, censor Muslims, defame Muslims, or violate their civil rights. So after 9/11, that group was Al-Qaeda. After 2007, that group was ISIS. Insert into the blank. Today, that group is Hamas. There will always be some militia or insurgency group the American government and Islamophobes will point to as representative of Muslims to justify oppressing our community here in the United States. So long as Muslim identities continues to be racialized, our communities will remain vulnerable to having our civil rights eviscerated each time there is a political crisis in the Middle East, in North Africa, or a Muslim majority country. And we will remain the scapegoats. We will be censored at best, speaking from experience, or criminalize at worst when we practice our political rights to dissent against US foreign policy or debate fellow Americans to challenge their racist analysis of Muslims, Islam, and Muslim majority countries. Now, I'm almost out of time, but I want to make one more point. Taking this backdrop to the current political moment, which I know all of you are experiencing, especially as college students, what we are witnessing is a full circle from the pre-9/11 era, when the quintessential foreign terrorist was Palestinian, back to the quintessential terrorist being Palestinian, or Muslim, or Arab, or those who support them. So Palestinian identity has been racialized as a terrorist, anti-Semitic villain, as a punishment for daring to reject the colonization of their land, first by the British government and then by European Jewish settlers. Palestinians have always suffered a double harm. The first harm is being ethnically cleansed from their land, evicted from their homes, occupied by the Israeli military, and extrajudicially killed by settlers and the Israeli military, and denied basic human rights and dignity for over 75 years. The second harm is that they're being punished for rejecting, condemning, or resisting in any way, including nonviolent ways, whatsoever their oppression. First by the British, then by the Israeli government, and now by the United States government, European nations, and Israel. So this double punishment is a classic case of racism. Oppressed for being presumed inferior, and then punished for fighting to stop being oppressed. Now, in the American context, the racialization of Palestinians has a very specific political objective: to justify millions of European Jews violently establishing a new nation state at the expense of Palestinians' lives, their livelihoods, their security, their land, and their self-determination. That the 750,000 Palestinians forcibly evicted from Palestine in 1948 had lived there for centuries and generations was of no consequence, because they were treated as mere colonial subjects who were not fully human, and thus undeserving of the protections of Western liberalism, such as human rights, self-determination, civil rights, dignity, safety. But in stark contrast, European Jewish settlers to Palestine are treated as the inheritors of the land and water, because over 2,000 years ago, their ancestors lived there. Whatever happened between those 2,000 years is of no consequence, because the Palestinian people are of no consequence in the Western colonial and post-colonial world order. Palestinians to Israelis and Americans are no different than the Algerians to the French: inferior, savage, and undeserving of human dignity or self-determination. So I will end here, and I'm happy to elaborate on this during our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahara. And as you guys could see, there's so much content that we can and should be covering, but unfortunately, we just don't have all the time that we need. A couple things that you mentioned that we can take a deeper look at is some of the stereotypes that exist about Muslims. And ISPU and the Bridge Initiative have something that's called the Islamophobia Index, where we ask the public and other in different faith communities their agreement with some of those stereotypes, and we actually measure that over the years, and that's where my point about it is increasing every year. In some of those statements, do you think that Muslims are less civilized than other groups? Do you think they're misogynistic? Do you think they should be blamed for the acts of others? And so you could check that on our website, but the one that always stick out, that's the most salient, is that Muslims are misogynistic. And the point on racialization is, do we experience more gender Islamophobia, or racial or religious? And there's always the racial part that sticks out. So in African American Muslim women will have, quote unquote, a worse experience than, let's say, a white, Protestant women in this country, just because of the double racialization and religious minority group. And then the last point I want to kind of add here is also from the research we see that One of the ways to counter Islamophobia is actually by demystifying Islam. So it's good to know Muslims. It's good to have friends who are Muslims. It's good to do all of the things that we're all trying to do. But one of the key ways is to keep demystifying Islam, because there is such a connection between how the Muslim community, as a faith community and as a racialized community, are grouped into just Islam itself. So, Robert.
Yes.
Just kind of building off that, and I know CARE collects cases and stories of actual incidents and actual cases of discrimination. So I've heard you talk a lot about the connection between Islamophobia and McCarthyism. Can you please elaborate on that connection? How do you see the connection there? And also, because we live in such a moment of misinformation and disinformation, how that's creating a culture setting where Islamophobia thrives, and what are some of the tools that Muslim organizations and Muslim individuals are exercising and using today to counter policies that are Islamophobic and just discrimination in general? And I will try to keep all of you to time because
I appreciate that. So first, I would like to thank the National American Muslim Policy Conference for having me here, as one does, and I'm really happy to join all the panelists as well. In focusing on this rising tide of what you could frame as McCarthyism 2.0 rebranded, I really do want to talk about how it's found its ways in Congress and the U.S. government. The tactics of McCarthyism heavily rely on unsubstantiated accusations of guilt by association backed by usually congressional or federal law enforcement investigations. We saw this, back in the 50s with Senator Joseph McCarthy with the committee on the House Committee on Un-American Activities. What we don't realize is that committee actually went back to like the 1930s. And slightly before, they were targeting Italian immigrants under the guise of anarchism. They were targeting pro-union labor groups, immigrants that were bringing labor ideas into the United States. So there's always this othering of immigrants coming into the United States and declaring a lot of their activities as being un-American, as we just heard about. So for the past several decades, organizations representing Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and allied communities are countless leaders. They've been targeted by a multi-million-dollar U.S. Islamophobia network, as you were just kind of discussing in the tracking of that. Right after the events of the Oklahoma City bombing, actors from that network in the 90s were saying, well, this bombing had a very Arab or Muslim-esque signatures of terrorism. Now, we actually found out it was a right-wing white extremist, but their job is to seed fear and doubt about Muslims and Arabs living in America. And sadly, one of the motivating factors has been always to silence us because they're afraid of our communities developing our own institutions, speaking to our concerns, and one of those concerns actually being the plight of Palestinians and their lack of human rights because of Israel. And so that's a whole longer conversation I can get into later. This is also paralleled by a network of some pro-Israel organizations like the ADL and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, along with numerous elected officials and some in law enforcement who subscribe or even promote these anti-Muslim or anti-Arab misinformation and conspiracy theories. One of the most recent examples, we can see that from the law enforcement side, is when in the fall, twice, FBI Director Christopher Wray testified that his agency, the FBI, was seriously concerned about American citizens being inspired to commit acts of violence by overseas designated terrorist groups. And this is a dog whistle, he never said it, but for Muslim Americans, or maybe susceptible students, the way he was framing it. What we didn't hear in that committee hearing was that our communities, our youth, our students have been violently attacked, sometimes murdered, all in the name of either vigilante justice or even by law enforcement officers that have been shutting down these recent student protesters. And what we see is state violence trying to enforce complicity with the U.S. support of Israel's state violence. And so that's just something to keep in mind. So again, the whole purpose of this type of othering and McCarthyism is to silence our advocacy efforts, especially when it comes in terms of Palestinian human rights, by painting us with a very broad brush. And their tactics usually involve in bad faith accusations. We're labeled as proxies or supporters of foreign governments or designated terrorist groups. And their goal is to make us politically radioactive, as being unapproachable and a group you wouldn't want to be caught listening to deny us a platform to express our concerns. So over the past 20 years, we've seen some attempts by state lawmakers and even, in one case, a member of Congress, falsely claim that American Muslim groups are outgrowths of either the Muslim Brotherhood or pawns of Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, or most recently Turkey with its ascent. These accusations are often diametrically opposed to each other and are used to criminalize our speech and subject us to either congressional or law enforcement investigations, which really is reminiscent of the McCarthy era witch hunts. So this is kind of a continuation of McCarthyism. It's a new McCarthyism. It's more from Cold War fears of communist infiltration to now a fear of American Muslims asserting themselves. They'll code it as being concerned about the spread of Sharia, or what they would say Sharia law, which are guiding Islamic principles. It's like saying law. And it fuels legislation that at first was framed as being anti-Sharia law bills at the state level. Then we saw, after successful constitutional challenges by groups like CARE and others, they were then switched to anti-foreign law bills. And now this has morphed, as it's passed in as many states as could, into boycotts of the boycott of Israel, or the BDS movement. So in the past 2 months, we've also seen the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability and the Committee on Education and Workforce try to silence the criticism of Israeli policies through their declared investigation of 20 Arab, Muslim, progressively Jewish, or even foundational charities to, again, make us afraid of what we should do next in trying to call out this genocide, to call for a ceasefire. But these efforts have largely failed to curb our advocacy. And in short, again, they're just trying to target our free speech by conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism or ties to foreign actors, if not outright terrorism. And we've also seen the recent House adoption of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that includes specific criticism of Israel, and that would actually insert it into the Department of Education, which again is targeting student activism on campus. We're also seeing these concerning attempts by the chairs of those aforementioned committees to investigate our organizations just based solely on innuendo, and they're demanding the financial records, supposed financial records, on these organizations that were submitted to the Department of Treasury from banks. And this, again, is kind of a McCarthyistic witch hunt. And while these two committees have not gone to the level of subpoenas, we have now seen them send demand letters to some Palestinian organizations. Other organizations could be next, where they're asking for what is your communication between your group and another group? What are your records? Submit them to us. Thankfully, no power law behind it right now. It's an ask, but this could escalate. Another alarming example is the proposed legislation that was recently passed in the House that could strip the tax-exempt status of nonprofits, particularly those advocating for Palestinian human rights, on the allegation of being guilty of providing material support to terrorist groups. But this is the proposal would have it be done bureaucratically. It would be a designation by the Department of Treasury. It would not require charges by the Department of Treasury. If you would appeal under this law, first it would go bureaucratically, and if I ever went to the courts, the judge could see the classified evidence, but you could not see the classified evidence being used against you, only a summary, which is very similar to the already discriminatory and unconstitutional federal terrorism watch list, which I might add, CARE has, through leaks, discovered that it's composed of 98% Muslim names. Muhammad being the most popular. So while we've so far fended off the advancement of this horrible tax bill being attached to the FAA Authorization Act, or recently it wasn't added to the proposed list of amendments for the National Defense Authorization Act, we really have to stay guarded and keep on our toes. So kind of in addressing all this, I could get to, I guess, another 2 long pages of discourse, but what I'll say is we need to be loud, we need to be vocal, we need to be organized, we need to support each other's work on stage, and maybe I can get a question, I can answer the rest.
Thank you, Robert. A couple things just to point out from your conversation. One, that Islamophobia and all these discriminatory policies are not just in the last 7 or 8 or 9 months. This is something that we know have existed, and I'm sure Sahar and many others can talk about this. This is something that even predates 9/11.
Yes.
9/11. This is something that has been very old in this society. In one way it shows up is divorcing the American Muslim community from all of its parts, from all of the racial groups and ethnic groups that exist. So for example, when we think American Muslims, how many of us think African Americans or black, right? That's not the first image that comes to our mind unless you're in that space, of course, which is interesting considering that is the largest segment of our community. And then the second thing on discrimination in banking settings and against nonprofits. Again, it's showing up in the moment right now, but we have documented one of our reports that was published in 2022 showed that not only Muslim individuals experience a disproportionate discrimination in banking settings, but Muslim nonprofits and Muslim businesses are overwhelmingly discriminated or receive a disproportionate level of discrimination in banking settings where their accounts are being closed, credit cards are closed. So there are a lot of things, and we've hosted many conversations on that with a lot of partners. So there's a lot of connections here to things that are historical.
There's a lot we could get into.
They're just kind of, coming to the surface now in a louder way. Student activism and student voices. I think this is where it's all kind of narrowing down in the moment. So Kate and I want to ask you, for a lot of people, college years are the time where you're discovering who you are, you're loud in voicing your opinion on things that you're passionate about. All of us have experienced that in a college environment. For Muslim students, though, there's a price to pay when you speak up. So student activism and advocacy for positive change seems to run in your blood. You seem like you've been doing it, even before college. So I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to address some of the challenges that Muslim student activists are facing today on college campuses. But even with that challenge, what motivates all of you to continue to push, even though there is a very higher price and higher risk that you might pay because of that?
Yeah, so first off, I want to take a moment to thank MPAC for helping to organize and being part of this conference. It's such a critical juncture for Muslim Americans ahead of this election. MPAC has provided a platform for policymakers, professors, advocates, elected officials, and students to all come together and present the most pressing challenges for the Muslim American community and be able to have, a very productive dialogue about that. So I know, my fellow panelists have mentioned a lot of the either academic or government relations aspects of this broader issue, but on campus, we're on the receiving end. So I'm hoping to provide that experiential perspective. So I'm sure many of you growing up have experienced this, but when I was growing up in my masjid, every halaqah, every khutbah, every discussion, every lecture, every sermon directed at us young Muslims was about navigating our religious and cultural values in the context of contemporary life. And it's difficult growing up as a young Muslim in America. There are so many distractions to derail us from our faith and disconnect us from our community. And college can be some of the most trying times for a young Muslim's life and faith. And that's not made any easier when college administrations fail to recognize Islamophobia as an issue on campus, or when they turn a blind eye to attacks against Muslim students. And when administrators and administrations ignore Islamophobia on campuses, it has its consequences because it legitimizes hate against Muslims. Muslim students and professors on my campus, American University, have been called terrorists and barbarians, and some of us have received death threats. So administration's silence and failure to hold haters accountable creates a breeding ground for Islamophobia. And more than being ignored, we are being actively silenced. Time and time again, Muslim students and student groups who've stood up for their rights have been systematically targeted. As mentioned, I'm a student at American University here in DC. It's just up the street on Massachusetts Avenue. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the situation there because I think it's a good cross-section of what's taking place at campuses across America. Following October 7th, tensions on campus kind of boiled over. Like many campuses, our Board of Trustees and administration implemented restrictions on free expression to highlight certain voices in our community and suppress others. These restrictions ranged from banning indoor protests to limiting postering to using vague language in the policy to target Muslim groups. They're even hiring an administrator just to selectively enforce this policy. And we in the Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian communities immediately recognized this as a mechanism to discriminate and silence us. Soon enough, administration used this power to place our chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine on probation. And when I and other Muslims in our student government stood up for the rights of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, when we condemned the administration for their actions, when we eventually passed that historic boycott, divest, and sanction resolution, administration decided to come after us. And for the first time in United States history, a college and university has placed its student government on probation.
Crazy.
And when AU students joined the encampment at George Washington University, just over a block away from here, the GW administration called in Metro PD to assault us and to beat, brutalize, pepper spray, and arrest my brothers and sisters. This chain of events isn't just taking place at American University, but in college campuses across America. Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinian students and our allies are under attack. So what path have we charted forward for ourselves? In our Student Senate at American University, we created a commission, as mentioned, to investigate how American University can divest from the genocide of our brothers and sisters in Palestine, but we're going a step further. We're looking into how Muslim students on campus have been systematically suppressed and how administration with us can end that cycle. When our research is over, we will draft, advocate for, and implement meaningful policy changes to make Muslims and Muslim students feel just as represented and respected as other communities on campus. We're also developing toolkits so student leaders across the United States at other universities can implement these same policy reforms. And lastly, in coalition with campuses across the country, we will draft and publish a universal declaration of student rights to say to administrators that these are our rights and this is a red line you will not cross. And unlike President Biden's red line with Rafah, we will stand our ground. Yeah. And throughout this entire struggle, as Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians, we have to remain conscientious about each other's experiences. So let's remember that we're advocating for a common cause, for the collective liberation of our community and our ummah. So I believe that in my generation, we are tired and we are fed up. And although we recognize the value of advocacy, if the past month has shown us anything, it is that the time for advocacy is over and the time for action is now. And when the young Muslim American community acts and rises up, we are an unstoppable force for good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to unpack there. I know we're very short on time, but if we have questions, please pass them through the note cards. One thing that I, as you were speaking, some thought that came to my mind, you mentioned Muslim youth, some of the struggles that Muslim youth are facing, and one of the things that we looked at is the struggle between their Muslim and their American identities, which is something that's always asked about or challenged. And you know, we're seeing the research show, you know, 90% say there is no disconnect between them being Muslims and being American. A matter of fact, this is something that each identity makes the other stronger. And Muslims in general are inspired by their faith to do good for themselves, for their community, and for others. So I'm going to try to read this question that I have here.
We have one more speaker.
Oh my God.
It's all good. It's all good.
We're just saving the best.
Ask me all the questions.
That's epic. I mean, I am so sorry.
No, it's all good. Following your lead.
Equal rights, right? I am very, very sorry about that. Wow, I don't think that have happened in a panel before, so, you know, let us be the first to do that. Ahmed, very sorry about that. My question to you, actually, is for American Muslims who are in public service and who are joining, you know, the government and different agencies at a higher rate than before to be part of the process. You represent MAPS, and you do work with those folks inside the federal government. What are you seeing in terms of Islamophobia from the inside? How are Muslims who are doing that work are experiencing it? And what are some of the ways that you're trying to counter that?
Thank you, Petra. Thank you all for having this very important discussion and topic and keeping it in the forefront. Muslim Americans in public service, I guess, was formed because a lot of the Islamophobia that you've heard about today also manifests in government. Why is government important? Well, I'm seeing a lot of Muslims, current, former, and prospective public servants in the room. Government is not like Starbucks or something you can just boycott, right? This government represents you. It speaks in your behalf. It enacts regulations that affect every facet of American life. You guys all know this, right? So what's often not known is how often Muslims face issues within all levels or branches of government, but also the fact that representation is incredibly important in all levels and branches of government. Well, again, these public institutions are supposed to represent all communities and supposed to look like the communities they serve and they represent. And that's not always the case. So in the recent years, we've seen a range of issues faced by Muslims. Things like just not being trusted by political appointees, by their senior executives. And so this has manifested in ways where people are not allowed in certain rooms or doxxed in some cases, or called foreign-born spies. What are you doing in these spaces? These are very important spaces and you shouldn't be here. Muslims should absolutely be in these spaces, and they have, and we're kind of invisible. We're kind of invisible from all sides. Muslim American organizations forget that we have a ton of Muslims in these mayor's offices and governor's offices and White House and federal departments when they engage with them. And of course, non-Muslims don't even see us because we're pretty invisible as it is. Public servants it's a very invisible field of work. You're not supposed to be seen, you're not supposed to have much of a role outside of your offices because you work on incredibly important national security issues, or you work on, or you're serving a higher principal on the Hill or in the White House. And that's been mostly fine, but it's been problematic when it results in being forgotten as an organization, as a community, as an identity. And I think it would serve the broader American society to understand that Muslims serve them at all levels and branches of government as well. So to answer your question, some of the things that we've seen as persistent issues are things along the lines of, first of all, you have the entrance to public service. Everyone has to go through security clearance, and that has proven to be very discriminatory at times. Muslims have been faced with extra levels of scrutiny, some things that are well known, some of them aren't. So for example, the FBI had this post-adjudicated risk management program that they did since 2002, post 9/11. And it was initially supposed to be screening Muslim translators and things like this for additional scrutiny. You'd get extra polygraphs, you'd be kicked out much more readily. And this went on for many years. And eventually it grew to other agencies where Muslim staff and Asian American staff, so Asian American and Muslim Americans, trying to stop the Chinese threat and trying to stop Iran or trying to stop, terror, whatever it is. These two groups had been constantly scrutinized, and this has been documented, especially in the last couple of years. The Department of Commerce had this internal police force going through personnel files and scrutinizing Muslims and Asians at a higher rate. The FBI, of course, was doing this until they quietly closed the program in 2019. So security clearance is one of the main ways of blocking Muslims from getting in these offices. But beyond that, once you're in, there's a lack of data collection on how many religious minorities or Muslim Americans serve, which is something that our organization has been very much in support of. I mean, if you don't know the nature of the issue, if you don't know what it looks like, they can just say, oh, how do you know everyone's not Muslim already in the government? It's like there's no data collected. There is some offices that collect it on a voluntary basis, but we feel that this is one of the major areas of room for improvement because you're collecting data now on other groups as well. So there's data collection, there's security clearance reform, there's religious accommodation in the workplace, there's training. A lot of the training that the federal government offers for its foreign service or national security personnel in the Middle East are taught by sometimes Islamophobes. Or they conflate Islamism with Muslim society. And these are incredibly potent and incredibly powerful pressure points because these trainings end up enabling or empowering the next generation of people who execute foreign policy in our region of the world. So we like to see a lot more awareness of things like training and things like training the current workforce on how to best engage the Muslim American community outside of their departments and their Muslim staff as well. We worked with ISPU on having a toolkit that does just that. We often emphasize the need for this type of awareness. I mean, when I worked at DHS, they were very big on DEIA, right? But they didn't connect in their minds that DEIA also includes religious accommodation. To them, it's only the one or two type of groups that are included in diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. So, we'd love to have more awareness of, not just all levels and branches of the government. The federal government is the country's largest employer, making sure that all can serve and all can serve with distinction and they can serve their communities in a way that's not discriminatory is a priority for all of you. And if you're not interested in public service, then your kids will. And we try to make sure that all government is accommodating for all of them moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed, and my apologies again. So we are literally at time. I know I had additional, we had additional questions. And a lot of the questions that I'm seeing here is about what to do about certain things. Who are Islamophobes? What are the agencies that fund them? All of that. CARE has a full report on that. We have multiple reports. So check their website.
Islamophobia.org.
There you go. Literally.
It's a good website.
On students in academia, Sahar Aziz, you follow her. There's so much that she shares with her center as well. And
I'll just, if I may put a plug in for the center. So we just published a report called Presumptively Anti-Semitic, Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse. Just happened to be published in the fall. We've been working on it for 2 years. But if you go to csrr.rutgers.edu and you follow all the social media accounts, there are plenty of resources at your disposal.
And of course, support what the students are doing. Not only support what they're doing, but help protect them, because that is the generation. There's a question about, do we only need protests or do we need one thing or the other? I think we need all forms of activism that we're doing. Please support their organization, support MAPS, and follow all of the work that everyone is doing here because it will answer some of the questions that you're having. I want to conclude, and I am very, very sorry to finish this, but we are at time. I want to conclude by saying Islamophobia is not a new thing. It's something that's been around for a very long time. We are speaking about it publicly today, and that is a success. That is something that we can, add to that impact into the success that we're having. And even with all the challenges that the American Muslim community faces, it continues to be one of the most active and engaged faith communities in the nation. We continue to, increase our civic engagement. We continue to increase our impact to this country and address the needs of all those around us. And social justice is actually the third policy priority that American Muslims have after healthcare and economics. So that continues to be a thing that we worry about, not only for ourselves, but for others. For the call to action is please follow every single one that's here because they have calls to action. We need all hands on deck.
And here too.
Yes, and that. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Thank you to the panelists, and I apologize about any mistakes that we've had on this panel that I did. But thank you all.
You were great.
And I'll hand it over to Iman for announcements and lunch.
Thank you so much, Petra.